Chapter 1 of Opposing Viewpoints White-Collar Crime Series is Corruption a Major Problem? Chapter preface. At the root of an idea like corruption or bribery is the concept of fairness. The law is a public agreement, and inherent to that is the notion that it will apply to everyone equally. Often, however, that isn't the case. In the shadows, money changes hands in exchange for special favors and privileges. Few crimes have been part of the human condition for longer, as its fundamental logic draws from inequalities that have been part of human society from its very start. For as long as there have been laws, there have been people who have believed they are above them. More so than most crimes, bribery is a crime where it inherently takes two to tango. There are the unscrupulous public officials who take the bribes, but there are also the wealthy individuals who use bribes in order to get what they want, whether that is evading punishment or getting around bureaucratic red tape. In that way, the dark underworld of bribes often becomes a window into needs and wants that are not being met by legal means. Often, it's in developing countries where basic resources are not as easily accessible, where corruption is reported to run rampant and illegal shadow marketplaces reign supreme. When most voters around the world are asked what is the biggest problems with elected officials are, corruption remains an omnipresent complaint. Sometimes, like in Brazil during the 1910s, this can result in political upheaval. One of the largest anti-corruption investigations in the country's history will eventually ensnare the popular leftist politician Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, preventing him from running for president in 2018 against the far-right conservative Jair Bolsonaro, who ran on promises to clean up the country's purportedly dirty political system. Just a few years later, however, Lula would end up in power again following the 2022 election. The following chapter looks at how countries around the world look at the issue of corruption, along with who engages in it and why it matters. And the beginning of the chapter after the preface begins with a quote, "Corrupted economies are not able to function properly because corruption prevents the natural laws of the economy from functioning freely." The negative impacts of corruption is the next subtitle. It looks like the author is Elvin Mirziev. In this viewpoint, Elvin Mirziev lays out the political corruption on a mass scale, grinds the economic gears of developing countries around the world. Instead of looking at how corruption manifests, Mirziev examines how its impacts are distributed. He maintains that the negative effects of corruption are unevenly distributed. This stands in the way of development for countries that are most in need of it. Elvin Mirziev is the chief financial officer at a company called Norm OJSC, which is a cement producer in Azerbaijan and the South Caucasus region. As you read, consider the following questions. How does this viewpoint say that corruption impacts prospects for innovation? What are shadow businesses, and what are some of the ways that this viewpoint makes the case for corruption's trickle-down impact? This is the beginning of that piece. Economies that are afflicted by a high level of corruption, which involves the misuse of power in the form of money or authority to obtain, authority to achieve certain goals in illegal, dishonest, or unfair ways, are not capable of prospering as fully as those with a low level of corruption. Corrupted economies are not able to function properly because corruption prevents the natural laws of the economy from functioning freely, which is the quote we read at the beginning. As a result, corruption in the nation's political and economic operations causes its entire society to suffer. Next subheading, data on corruption's impact. According to the World Bank, the average income in countries with a high level of corruption is about a third of that of countries with a low level of corruption. Also, the infant mortality rate in such countries is about 3 times higher, and the literacy rate is 25% lower. No country has been able to completely eliminate corruption, but studies show that the level of corruption in countries with emerging market economies is much higher than it is in developed countries. High prices for low quality. Corruption in the way deals are made, contracts are awarded, or economic operations are carried out leads to monopolies or oligopolies in the economy. Those business owners who can use their connections or money to bribe government officials can manipulate policies and market mechanisms to ensure they are the sole provider of goods and services in the market. Monopolists, because they do not have to compete against alternative providers, tend to keep their prices high and are not compelled to improve the quality of goods or services they provide by market forces that would have been in operation if they had significant competition. Embedded in those high prices are also the illegal costs of the corrupt transactions that were necessary to create such a monopoly. If, for example, a home construction company had to pay bribes to officials to be granted licenses for operations, these costs incurred will, of course, be reflected in artificially high housing prices. In next subheading, inefficiently allocated resources. In best practice, companies choose their suppliers via tender processes, which are requests for tender or requests for proposal, which serve as mechanisms to enable the selection of suppliers offering the best combination of price and quality. This ensures the efficient allocation of resources. In corrupted economies, the companies that otherwise would not be qualified to win the tenders are often awarded projects as a result of unfair or illegal tenders that are tenders that involve kickbacks. This results in excessive expenditure in the execution of projects that substandard or failed projects, leading to overall inefficiency in the use of resources. Public procurement is perhaps most vulnerable to fraud and corruption due to the large size of financial flows involved. It's estimated that in most countries, public procurement constitutes between 15% and 30% of gross domestic product. And for the winners of those bids, procured by illegal tenders, you've awarded, a project or a deal for construction or other purpose to a person that's already prone to bribery. And that being said, there can be overrun in the project completion that may very well be due to kickbacks, as the winner of that bid is again prone to that type of behavior. Alright, so we talked about how that constitutes 15 to 30% of gross domestic product. Next subheading is unequal distribution of wealth. Corrupted economies are characterized by a disproportionately small middle class and significant divergence between the living standards of the upper class and the lower class. Because most of the country's capital is aggregated in the hands of oligarchs, or persons who back corrupted public officials, most of the created wealth also flows to these individuals. In a corrupt economy, small businesses are not widely spread and are usually discouraged because they face unfair competition and illegal pressures by large companies that are connected with government officials. Certain industries are more prone to corruption than others, making small businesses in these sectors even more vulnerable to unethical business practices. Next subheading, low stimulus for innovation. Because little confidence can be placed in the legal system of corrupted economies in which legal judgments can be rigged, potential innovators cannot be certain their invention will be protected by patents and not copied by those who know they can get away with it by bribing the authorities. There is thus a disincentive for innovation, and as a result, emerging countries are usually the importers of technology because such technology is not created within their own societies. Next subheading, a shadow economy exists. Small businesses in corrupt countries tend to avoid having their businesses officially registered with tax authorities to avoid taxation. As a result, the income generated by many businesses exists outside the official economy and thus is not subject to state taxation or included in the calculation of the country's GDP. Another negative of shadow businesses is they usually pay their employees decreased wages lower than the minimum amount designated by the government. Also, they do not provide acceptable working conditions, including appropriate health insurance benefits for employees, and they may be funded by illegal procured or funds procured from illegal businesses such as money launderers. Next subheading, low foreign investment and trade. Corruption is one of the disincentives for foreign investment. Investors who seek a fair, competitive business environment will avoid investing with countries where there is a high level of corruption. While investing in emerging markets remains a popular investment area, investors are naturally hesitant to put their money at risk with countries known to have high corruption levels. Studies show a direct link between the level of corruption in a company and measurements of the competitiveness of its business environment. Subheading, poor education, healthcare. A working paper of the International Monetary Fund shows corruption has an adverse impact on the quality of education and healthcare provided in countries with emerging economies. Corruption increases the cost of education in countries where bribery and connections play an important role in the recruitment and promotion of teachers. As a result, the quality of education decreases, and this affects the overall health of the economy. Also, corruption in the designation of healthcare providers and recruitment of personnel, as well as the procurement of medical supplies and equipment in emerging economies, results in inadequate healthcare treatment and a substandard or restricted medical supply, lowering the overall quality of healthcare. The bottom line, many countries with emerging economies suffer from a high level of corruption that slows their overall development. The entire society is affected as a result of the inefficient allocation of resources, the presence of a shadow economy, and low quality education and healthcare. Corruption thus makes these societies worse off and lowers the living standards of most of the population. Chapter 1 ends on page 24.